Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Russia has intensified its campaign of mass drone and missile attacks on Ukraine, with the latest strikes on Kyiv causing mounting civilian casualties as rescue operations continue. At the same time, new reports suggest Moscow may be using vessels from its so-called shadow fleet to support drone operations, raising fresh questions about hybrid warfare and European security. Joining us today on TVP World is Olena Lennon, Adjunct Professor in the Department of National Security at the University of New Haven. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
So we're looking at the recent strikes and the scale of these attacks on Kyiv, which is massive, left a lot of people dead and civilian infrastructure damage as well. Now, is this simply just an increase in scale, or are we looking at a shift in a broader strategy?
Well, in some ways, it's more of the same. It's the continuation of Russia's brutal pressure campaign against Ukrainian civilians, using coordinated air attacks and exhausting Ukrainian air defenses, sending hundreds of drones and cruise missiles first to activate air defense, and then hitting with ballistic missiles that only Patriot systems can intercept, and creating a lot of damage on the ground, direct hits. So in some ways, it's the continuation of Russia's response to now Ukraine's ability to strike energy infrastructure inside Russia. But in other ways, it is a shift in not only in terms of the brutality of these attacks, but also a shift in global conversations as we are anticipating a very important meeting in Ankara, a NATO summit on Tuesday. And it's very clear that the Russians are trying to be at the top of the conversation. They're trying to set the agenda, shape the conversation to show Western leaders, including the US and Ukraine, that will be taking part in the summit, that despite its declining economy, despite its military casualties, that Russia still has escalation advantage. And in some ways, it's psychological pressure trying to intimidate Western leaders into believing that Russia is invincible and it's still able to rebuild its military despite Ukraine's capabilities and despite sanctions. So the context has changed. I think the context very much is Ukraine's ability to strike deep inside Russia and the upcoming summit. But the military campaign itself has not changed. It's still very much persistent pressure on Ukraine to capitulate.
And now, when we ask various different experts and analysts on these latest strikes, there's usually two lines of thinking. One being that it's mostly out of desperation because Russians aren't really achieving that much on the front line. And the other, like you mentioned, it's perhaps a way to try to force Ukraine to make some sort of compromise, especially seeing that we're having a NATO summit that's coming up. Perhaps it's also to kind of build internal pressure within Ukraine and intimidate its allies as well. Ultimately, what do you think the strategic calculus is behind this? And do you think that the Western allies will be able to perceive it and navigate it? Or do you think that the intimidating factor would actually have some effect?
Well, I think it's all of that. It's both, right? In some ways, in many ways, it is a sign of despair on Russia's side. It is, there's revenge. And they're acting obviously in these meltdowns that they are unleashing on Ukraine, obviously are a sign of anger and humiliation. That said, it's not new that the strategic picture remains the same, that Russia is not those are not isolated escalations, that Russia in a strategic competition with the West. And Ukraine is only one of the battlefields. And in that sense, I think that, from Russian point of view, they're just keeping at it. They're increasing pressure to use the momentum. And the momentum is midterm elections in the U.S. That now that the U.S. administration here, the Trump administration is bogged down in Iran, bogged down in with midterm elections. So the conversation here in the U.S. is increasingly about competition for seats in the U.S. Congress in the upcoming election. So, the Russians are taking advantage of the shift in attention and trying to degrade more of Ukraine's power to eventually force it to capitulate. I think the shortcoming on the European side is that they're continuing to treat these escalations and attacks as isolated, including hybrid attacks and hybrid operations in Europe. But all of these escalations and the shadow fleet being used to use surveillance drones and attack drones in Europe, that's all part of one strategic campaign that's designed to undermine Western power and to deny Ukraine an ability to survive as an independent state.
Right, that's actually a very important thing that you just touched upon, and I would like to touch on it as well. The hybrid operation, especially now we have some reports about drone-related incidents that's been disrupting aviation and critical infrastructure in parts of not just in Ukraine but also Europe. At what point do these operations become a broader NATO security challenge rather than solely a Ukrainian issue? And do you think Western leaders are kind of turning a blind eye to it because they don't have any correct response to it, or what are the other concerns that is kind of contributing to this hesitation?
Right, you're absolutely right. As cliche as it is to say it's hybrid warfare, right? But we don't have a better term. It really is a catch-all phrase, and it's a multi-domain operation. Russia is a strategic competition with the West, which includes meaning that they're trying to undermine the West's vulnerabilities in economic, military, diplomatic fronts, and including in the energy sector as well. So I think that as much as I appreciate your use of the future tense, that at what point will the European leaders elevate this issue and its importance? I think that the time is now, that the Russians, one of the, or it's past overdue, because it's one of the objectives of this hybrid warfare is to expose vulnerabilities in European air defense and test responses. And the Russians have actually succeeded in testing NATO's response. And the response was that the threshold for collective, for activating NATO's air defenses and for collective response is actually much higher than we thought it was. That we didn't see as strong of a response from NATO as we had anticipated. And that was precisely what Russia was trying to achieve, is to test the response and then to expose vulnerabilities and to show NATO members and the broader community that NATO is not as strong, not as decisive as it may appear. So I think that NATO members have now really have to push back against that optic and really double down on unity and show in every possible way, defense spending, political will, that it's a strong, united alliance, and that Russia will it will not be as easy to undermine it.
Right, like you mentioned, NATO probably should have had stepped up, like in, probably yesterday. And with the upcoming summit in Ankara, though, do you think that things will change, or are we going to perhaps see another meeting that schedules another meeting?
Again, I think it's both. In some ways, it is going to be more of kind of same conversation. But given how desperately everybody is trying to shape the conversation for the upcoming summit, my sense is that it's going to be a very important summit. Because Ukrainians are now increasingly demonstrating their ability to strike inside Russia, and also with Ukraine, while Ukraine is not itself a global energy player, it is showing that Russia's ability to be an important energy actor depends very much on Ukraine. That Ukraine can at any point deny Russia an ability to export oil. And in that way, Ukraine has to be included in all conversations about stabilizing energy markets. So Ukraine is playing very strategically here, shaping a conversation in NATO. The Russians are also signaling their escalation advantage. Americans are also, with Trump calling Zelensky and Putin yesterday, that was also intentional. That's also an attempt to sort of set agenda. So my sense is that given how desperately everybody is trying to get on NATO agenda on Tuesday and Wednesday, that these conversations will be important. Now, that said, I think in many ways, the content of those conversations probably is going to be the same. It's defense spending. But I think one thing that will be different is not just how much each member contributes, who contributes 5, who spends 5% on their defense and who is still lacking behind. But the conversation is now shifting toward not just spending on to increase NATO's deterrence capability and posture, but defense. How should NATO spend money more efficiently, given the modern warfare and the realities of modern warfare, drone warfare? So it's not just the optics of it's not just deterrence. It's actually the conversation will revolve around, can NATO defend itself? So we're past the deterrence game with Russia. We are very much in the defense game. And of course, the military aid for Ukraine will be a big part of that conversation. One item that I think will for sure be missing is Ukraine's membership in NATO. I think that's very much off the table at this point. And my sense is that nobody's even it's unlikely that it's going to be a conversation item. And of course, what NATO has learned from the Iran escalation, maritime security and energy security will also be a new item on the agenda. But in many ways, this is still going to be, kind of diplomatic maneuvering, posturing, because even with the phone conversations between Trump and Putin and then Trump and Zelensky, it was obvious that no details were discussed as far as in terms of ceasefire, sanctions, reparations. That it was still very much general. Everybody wants peace, but the details, in this kind of war at this point, details are not secondary to the big picture. That the devil is in the details, and nobody has so far actually started negotiating those details.
Right. We got a little bit of time here. I would like to pick your brains on addressing, the elephant in the room, which is going to be Donald Trump being in the NATO meeting as well. Recently, we've seen in a G7 meeting that Trump has actually been more warm towards Ukraine compared to his previous rhetoric. But at the same time, it does seem like the rift between Trump and the European allies are increasingly growing as well. What do you think the mood is going to be like going into this summit? Do you think that Trump will now be more favorable to Ukraine, or because of his spat with some of the European leaders, is still going to be a little bit of a touchy issue?
Without a doubt, Trump has warmed up to Zelensky in Ukraine. Trump respects and he likes strong leaders, and Zelensky, picked up on that a long time ago. And Trump, I think, respects Ukraine's ability to respond more aggressively to Russia's attacks and actually deny Russia an ability to be an energy actor and strike deep inside Russia with their own homemade capabilities. That matters a lot to Trump, especially because Trump Trump continues to look at Russia as an important partner, not least because of Russia's ability to stabilize energy markets. And now Trump understands that without Ukraine, just talking to Russia is not going to be, he's not going to be able to, make deals and stabilize oil prices. Because during the hot phases of the Iran war, we saw that Trump actually started making, issuing waivers for Russia to be able to export its oil despite sanctions. So we saw that Trump needed Russia in the global oil market, and now he understands that Ukraine is as big of a player as Russia is, and I think that's a great accomplishment for Ukraine.
Right, definitely very interesting here. We're seeing that Ukraine went from not having any cards to actually creating its own cards to play at the table. So we'll have to see how things develop. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight, and thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.